Greetings from exotic Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. This is the UFC 161 MMAfighting.com preview show. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani. UFC 161 headlined by Dan Henderson versus Rashad Evans is just hours away, and we have called upon one of Canada's finest, hailing from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. He is the heart and soul of Sherdog.com. He is the inimitable Jordan Breen, making his debut on the preview show. Jordan, how are you?
I'm well. I mean, exotic Winnipeg. If I was going to get to do the preview show, this is obviously the city. Any Canadian city, this is where I would want to do it.
We waited till we got to Winnipeg to get you on this thing. It's great to have you here. We certainly appreciate your work at Sherdog, and I think you're going to blow away everyone as far as encyclopedic knowledge. So I'm just going to sit here and just fire away some trivia.
I see, like the curtain's been pulled back now. Like I don't have an earpiece, anything like that. I'm probably going to blow it. Going to blow it.
You know, when this card was first announced, it was Henderson versus Eddie Wineland. Shogun versus Little Nog 2 was on the card. Those fights aren't happening. Tell me how excited, scale of 1 to 10 you were for this card, and now, with the injuries, the changes, how much you're looking forward to it.
I think context matters a bit here. I mean, when you look at the last time the UFC went to Western Canada and had an awful card in Calgary, there were some bright spots here and there, but because it was so injury-laden, because Hayden Barrow and Uriah Faber wasn't exactly a headliner that people were really into, a lot of people were incredibly upset with how that Calgary card developed. This particular card was pretty darn good on paper from top to bottom, unfortunately, with the Hayden Barrow-Eddie Wineland bout falling apart, and then the rematch between Shogun and Nogueira also falling by the wayside, in addition to a bunch of undercard injuries, head injuries to Soa Palele, Ike Valley, Flag, several fights changed in the weeks leading up to. So I think the fact that this kind of thing has happened in Western Canada before probably makes a bit more weeping and gnashing of teeth for Western Canadian MMA fans. There's probably a lot of people who were at the card in Calgary who feel slighted paying UFC ticket prices twice and not maybe getting the card that they wanted. But still, this is still a decent MMA card, but I don't even know if it necessarily stacks up to the Calgary card in terms of main card type talent. We have an incredibly important fight with Rashad Evans and Dan Henderson, but without the Wineland and Barrow fight, and certainly without the Nogueira and Shogun fight, there's much less sizzle to whatever potential stake there is on this card.
It's interesting that you mentioned an incredibly important main event between Rashad and Dan Henderson, both of them coming off losses, both former champions in different organizations. Rashad probably put on his worst performance ever against Little Nog.
I want to. Can I flip this to you?
Sure.
Can you think of a time that a better fighter, a more accomplished elite fighter in mixed martial arts, had a performance as dismal as Rashad Evans? Because this isn't like a guy being over the hill and getting old overnight or being punchy or something like that. This is literally a case of a super skilled, well-accomplished, elite mixed martial arts fighter going out and having a miserable performance against a fighter that no one looks at that fight and thinks Nogueira's a better fighter than Rashad Evans, despite the fact he handily beat him. It's hard for me to think of a worse performance from an elite fighter in recent MMA memory.
So what do you chalk that up to? Do you chalk that up to maybe John Jones not only physically beating him up when they fought at UFC 145, but mentally as well? And after that fight, Rashad flirted with the idea of retirement, and I tend to feel like when fighters start to think about retirement, when they have a foot out the door, their next performance never lives up to what we are accustomed to seeing from them. What do you think it was? Or was it just maybe that was a kind of an underwhelming fight? It was the third most important fight on the card. Nog didn't have a lot of sizzle behind him, and maybe he just didn't take him seriously.
I think maybe a little column A, a little column B. I don't think Rashad Evans' style helps him a lot in fights like that. Even in Rashad Evans' biggest bouts, he lost the first round to Chuck Liddell, lost the first 2 rounds to Forrest Griffin. He's someone that, because he's not a high-output fighter and is often so counter-based and controls things so well with respect to his wrestling and his counterboxing, that typically, if someone's going to go out and pressure him, he's going to move away and wait for his opportunity. This was a fight where he never ended up really putting his foot on the pedal, though, never really got out of first gear. And so I think it's hard for a guy with a style like that who relies so much on countering and is so passive at times to suddenly turn it on after 7 or 8 minutes when he's in a hole the way that Evans was. But I think you bring up something more material and more important. Going into that fight, Evans was talking about, I wish I could see my kids more. I don't know if I like being in Florida and doing things this way. That's the case. Maybe you shouldn't be training in Florida. Maybe Black Zillions isn't the best setup for him. Maybe he needs to get closer to home. Maybe he needs to go back to upstate New York. I can't say what the specific recipe is for Rashad Evans, but I don't think his style and general style helped him against Rogerio Nogueira, but definitely didn't look like the preparation and mental focus was there either. And when you look at what a fighter's talking about, what his actual thoughts are before a contest, if you're going into a fight like Nogueira, even if there wasn't a lot of hype behind it, and you're talking about wanting to see your kids and how different your career is and maybe looking at an exit strategy, it's not going to be conducive or productive towards success and getting your hand raised.
And then considering the fact that Dan Henderson had a rather underwhelming performance against Lyoto Machida in February, who do you think has more pressure on his shoulders going into this fight?
I think it depends on how you reckon pressure. I mean, if Rashad Evans were to lose, I think people would really see him in kind of a no man's land and without a particular destination. He could still potentially fight at 185 pounds, but most of the interest and intrigue for Rashad Evans as a middleweight was when Anderson Silva didn't have a lineup of opponents or didn't have a lot of middleweights that people were excited for. So that's still a potential exit strategy for him if he were to lose, but Rashad Evans would very quickly go from being someone that was seen as a perennial contender for a title, someone's always a fight or two away, to having lost 2 in a row, probably not in great fashion, and being thought of as an also-ran. For Dan Henderson, if he's to be believed that getting a chance to fight John Jones and getting a crack at the UFC light heavyweight title again is really his goal, it would be catastrophic. I mean, if Dan Henderson were to lose to Rashad Evans, it would be hard to imagine a way for him to get back into contention, especially quickly, going deep into his 40s, not being a guy who's fighting 3 or 4 times a year. So I think it's an interesting fight in that win for either guy, you're beating an elite light heavyweight. It's great to say you beat Rashad Evans or beat Dan Henderson, but a loss for either guy. It seems, I guess, the crux of the fight is that part of what makes it such a strange, bizarre, but kind of fantastic main event is that a win's great for either guy, but a loss is catastrophic. It's destructive. It's really jarring. So I think when you have that kind of stake, we normally focus on fights where wins are high stakes. Wins are going to be what gets you a title shot. This is an interesting fight in that really these guys are fighting not to lose because a lose would be so injurious to their career at this point.
Both fighters came into the sport as wrestlers. They don't really use their wrestling all that much these days, especially Dan Henderson. How do you see this fight playing out?
This is, I think, the most interesting point because we can talk all we want about the lackluster performances they put in. The lackluster performance for Dan Henderson and Rashad Evans over the course of their career, I think they go back to that question about style. When Rashad Evans has lackluster fights, it's guys who don't really open up on the feet, don't give him the chance to counter, or when he opts to use his wrestling, they're guys that he can't easily take down. He has to push them against the fence, try to control them. The latter, we see it, say, in the Thiago Silva and Michael Bisping fights. The former, we see it in, say, the Forrest Griffin fight up until he won, or the recent fight against Nogueira. Dan Henderson, on the other hand, for someone who has Olympic wrestling credentials, comes out so reckless at times that not only is he not going for takedowns, his defensive wrestling disappears. Dan Henderson's been taken down by far, far inferior wrestlers throughout his career, going back to his Pride days. So I'm really curious about how exactly it looks. I expect to see Dan Henderson pressuring Rashad Evans early, trying to move him back. And we know that Henderson with the big right hand could definitely hurt Evans. Evans has been knocked out before, wobbled in some other fights in which he was winning, like the Thiago Silva fight, for instance. I think that's got to be Dan Henderson's MO. But Rashad Evans, if he wants to counter, has to actually be active. It's completely useless to only get hit 5 or 10 times in the span of a fight if you're not throwing back and landing cleaner, harder blows. So with Rashad Evans being so economic and so risk-averse at times, and Dan Henderson being someone who defense can just go by the wayside, I'm curious in seeing what it looks like for 15 minutes if Dan Henderson is giving chase and Rashad Evans is moving away, trying to figure him out. Also, two guys who are pretty well-versed in fighting 25 minutes, they're going to only get 15 minutes round this time since it's a replacement main event. Curious in seeing how the 3-round dynamic maybe bears its impact on the fight.
Go on the record. Who's your pick and why?
I like Dan Henderson by decision.
Really?
I think Dan Henderson's someone who has good juju with judges. You look at fights that were close, were competitive. Many judges have seen them his way, whether the Rich Franklin fight or going back to Pride, the Ninja fight, the Yuki Kondo fight. There seems to be something about Dan Henderson's aggression, going forward, throwing hard strikes that judges respond to. Even the Lyoto Machida fight, people thought he beat Lyoto Machida, despite the fact he landed virtually no clean strikes. All he did was run forward, give chase, show pressure, but never any real effective offense. So I think with Dan Henderson having that kind of powerful control and being the guy who's more predisposed to going forward, landing hard shots, he'll probably curry favor with the judges. Plus, if we're looking at a potential stoppage here, Dan Henderson by knockout is the most likely way that one of these guys would finish the other. So I think there's slightly more in Dan Henderson's box to make him a favorite, but this is righteously a pick 'em fight when you look at the lines. I think that's reflected in the styles, the money movement. It's pretty close to a pick 'em as you're going to get in mixed martial arts, especially between elite fighters.
Now, the co-main event, if you want to call it that, is Roy Nelson returning a month and a half after he knocked out Czech Congo at UFC 159 in Newark, New Jersey. He is fighting Stipe Miocic, who was supposed to fight Sao Paulo on this card, but once all the injuries happened, they actually inserted Roy Nelson in there to maybe give this card a little more star power. What I think is most interesting about this fight is not so much the fight, but the result, because Roy Nelson enters this fight with 1 fight left on his contract, and if he wins, he has incredible power on his side. He has all the cards, right? If he loses, he's a lot weaker, and now the UFC can manipulate things and give him a lesser contract, etc. And if he wins, maybe he goes off to Bellator. We know there have been some problems with him and Dana White in the past. What intrigues you about this fight? Is it that, or is it the actual styles matchup?
You know what intrigues me about this fight? You are the go-to MMA pot stirrer. This is a rich pot right here. Roy Nelson is one of the few guys in MMA who, outside of being a champion, outside of being an immediate title challenger, has been able to accrue fans like a brand. Very few guys like a Clay Guida can do it. Michael Bisping's be able to do it. But there's very few guys in the UFC that are on a card that have never been a champion, that aren't really title challengers, that you think, I want to see that guy fight. Something about him. And Roy Nelson is one of them. Yet his entire UFC tenure has been on the god-awful Ultimate Fighter contract, which he's clearly... I'm not going to be one of these people who act like every fighter deserves $200,000 to show up and $500,000 to win. But Roy Nelson, even if you're just looking at market value of heavyweights, Roy Nelson's a lot better in 25 and 25, 30 and 30, 35 and 35. So I'm very curious in seeing if he wins this fight, and he's been installed as a big favorite against Stipe Miocic, as well he should be. It's a preferential style matchup against a guy that he can either out-grapple or potentially knock out in a stand-up war, which would make him look great. Above and beyond that, it's got to be the contract situation. Roy Nelson is someone who marches to the beat of his own drum. He's not someone, especially approaching his 40s, having a family, who's going to be swayed by the idea of, oh, well, all the best fighters in the UFC, that's where I'm supposed to be. If there's an opportunity for this guy to make money and do free agency the right way, he's absolutely going to do it. And I think it's a very curious part in MMA right now, when we're getting to a point where free agency matters for guys who aren't just champions. Because when we talked about free agency is a new concept for you and I to kind of discuss in relation to fighters. But typically when we've done it recently, it's Hector Lombard and his belt from Bellator coming to the UFC, or Eddie Alvarez's litigation. It's that kind of dynamic. It's not solid mid-card guys who've got a name, might be a borderline top 10 fighter, but ultimately aren't making the kind of money that they're probably worth on the open market. So Roy Nelson's a very curious kind of guinea pig, and if he can get his hand raised against Stipe Miocic, I think he's someone that's going to make many, many more headlines for what happens outside the cage and inside the cage the next few months.
So does Big Country enter free agency with momentum, or does Stipe Miocic, like Cleveland State back in 1986 in the NCAA tournament, shock the world?
I don't think we're going to get a Cleveland State do-over in this particular case. Stipe Miocic, in spite of his NCAA affiliation, is probably going to go down to the country club. I think the stand-up aspect, Stipe Miocic is a tough striker, and he's really great offensively, very hittable though, and when you've seen Stipe Miocic in the UFC, the fights in which he's had the most thrilling success, the fights where he's really vibed, are fights where guys fire back against him but don't have the kind of firepower that he does. Roy Nelson's a better straight technical boxer, better combinations with his hands, bigger one-shot knockout threat, and that's in addition to the fact that he's a better grappler than Stipe Miocic. For as much as we talk about Roy Nelson going into slugfest, trying to produce these entertaining fights that people love, he's a grappler first and foremost. He's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, so he's always got the fail-safe of being able to go to the ground, potentially tap Stipe Miocic, or take dominant position, punch him out that we did to Kimbo Slice, Mirko Krokop, whatever the case. Should be Roy Nelson by a stoppage if he gets after it. It should be exactly the kind of fight that gets him off on a right foot into free agency, and that's part of why it's so curious. I mean, if you are the UFC, why use Roy Nelson as your late replacement against Stipe Miocic, someone who might give him exactly the kind of fight that fans want to see Roy Nelson in, probably isn't going to beat him. I wouldn't say that Stipe Miocic is the perfect opponent for Roy Nelson, but he's pretty darn close if you're considering the idea of Roy Nelson having a big knockout, a big impressive showing on a UFC card, and then going into free agency, because that might be exactly the recipe we've got here.
Let's touch on two more fights before we go. First, Rosie Sexton versus Alexis Davis. Both of them making their UFC debuts. First ever UFC women's fight on Canadian soil. It's an interesting fight because a lot of people think Alexis Davis could be the one to one day dethrone Ronda Rousey. Rosie Sexton, very good fighter, only 2 losses on her record, but she's a 125er, and she's moving up. And also, speaking of retirement, she was pretty much done before she got this call. What are you expecting to see in this fight?
I think you get to the heart of it. We talked about what it means when someone's retiring. Rosie Sexton loves MMA, but she's someone with a PhD and worldly interest.
Smartest fighter in the UFC?
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Not even just smartest in terms of like might win an academic decathlon. If you like follow her on Twitter or talk to her, it's not just like the book learning or the fact that she could do really well in Trivial Pursuit. She's like a thoughtful, philosophical soul. It's definitely the kind of person you don't come across very much in mixed martial arts. So I might definitely give Rosie Sexton the gold medal almost immediately before she even fights. But as you mentioned, she's a 125er. She's a mom now. She's in a different place than Alexis Davis, who's dedicated herself wholesale to MMA, has gotten better and better. I would not hesitate to say that Alexis Davis is probably the most underrated woman at 135 pounds. Her grappling is sensational. She's a finisher. Normally, when you get 2 elite people in a weight class matched up, you don't normally see a lot of finishes, especially in women's MMA. You don't have a lot of 135-pound women hitting with bricks. but Alexis Davis can positionally dominate women and punch them out. She can submit them from there. She's dynamic. She's positional. Her stand-up is better than Rosie Sexton as well. I think this is a brilliant showcase fight for her. And as you alluded to, no one's going to be a favorite against Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey has such an overwhelming style and such an overwhelming athleticism that she's going to end up being a favorite against whoever she faces. But when you look at how Ronda Rousey has sacrificed position at times, owing to her judo background, exposed her back to Miocic Tate, exposed her back to Liz Carmouche, Alexis Davis is great positionally, super opportunistic. The Jiu-Jitsu Expo last year in Long Beach, she almost tapped Keira Gracie with an armbar for like 4 minutes on end in a straight grappling match. So if Ronda Rousey got in a fight in the future with Alexis Davis and showed her back the way she did against Carmouche Tate, I think we're talking about a greater level of danger, a greater level of peril than we've talked about for Ronda Rousey in the past. So even if there's a lot of check marks in the column for Ronda Rousey that would probably lead to her being a favorite and probably being successful against Alexis Davis in a title defense, if you're looking to upset a champion, you need someone who can do something dynamic. You're not normally going to just see someone who goes out and wins 4 or 5 rounds against a dynamic champion. How can you knock them out? How can you submit them? Alexis Davis actually has the chops to tap Ronda Rousey, and that's something you just don't see at 135 right now, and it makes her especially interesting and unique to follow as she heads into her debut against Rosie Sexton.
And interestingly enough, things come full circle for Alexis Davis. She made her MMA debut just down the street from here against Sarah Kaufman, lost that fight, looking to get on the winning track here in Manitoba on Saturday night. Okay, one more. This is a very big fight for Tyron Woodley. It's not on the pay-per-view, but arguably the second most important fight on the card. He fights Jake Shields. Wanted this fight, called him out. Is this an opportunity for Tyron Woodley to take that next step at 170? Do you foresee that happening?
I think it's absolutely a rich opportunity. Whether or not he gets it done against Jake Shields is something else. I think going back to talking about fighters' motivations, where their head's at, kind of bears in here as well. Tyron Woodley was clearly invigorated, maybe reinvigorated by what he did against Jay Heron in his UFC debut. We're talking about a guy that was immediately seen as a hot prospect. This guy can't miss. And then because of some of the mismanagement and poor matchmaking at times with Strikeforce and Showtime, he simply wasn't utilized. We had a very, very good prospect with exceptional athleticism and wrestling skills who's sitting by the wayside, and he ended up having some performances that didn't exactly thrill people, even in victory, like the Jordan Meehan fight, for instance. Ends up losing to Nate Marquardt. People soured on him as a prospect, saw him as just another guy. The Jay Heron fight really changed that script almost immediately because he did it so emphatically, so dramatically. Tyron Woodley has had his best success in the striking department against grapplers who don't want to strike. You look at how quickly he did away with Andre Galvao. When Tyron Woodley feels confident that someone's just going to take him down, he seems to let go with his hands and is a lot more effective that way. And I think that's something that'll give him a considerable advantage against Jake Shields. Jake Shields is elementary in the stand-up. He's not going to do anything to really hurt himself, but he's not going to be active and take over a fight. It's all to set up the takedown. And where Shields is a dogged and determined wrestler, he's not an explosive one. He's a guy that gets to your leg and eventually works you to the mat. With good chain wrestling, he's not going to explosively double leg you, take you down. So I think Tyron Woodley has a lot of chance to stand up and box and hit Jake Shields, and if he's stopping takedowns, probably a lot of time to defend, sit against the fence, pummel on Jake Shields. I think the way they happen to fight really bodes well for Tyron Woodley, especially when you look at how confident he's been against lackadaisical strikers or grapplers who really want no part of the striking against him. So I like Tyron Woodley here, but Jake Shields, you're one guillotine away. I mean, people I think forget because he's so strong positionally that he is a good finisher, super technical. I mean, I couldn't be shocked or really raise my eyebrows if Jake Shields, despite not looking great recently, was able to pull off a submission win over Tyron Woodley.
Great job, my man.
Oh, thank you. I was trying my best, trying not to screw up too bad. My big worry was that I was going to spit on you.
No,
and,
you didn't.
I didn't spit on you. So no spittle. I think we're good.
He is Jordan Breen of Sherdog.com. Follow him on Twitter, twitter.com/Jordan Breen. Check him out on Sherdog.com. And we've got a very interesting night coming up on Saturday. It's just hours away. It's UFC 161. It's the biggest show to ever come to Manitoba. And MMA Fighting.com will be there with its usual fight night coverage, videos, photos, live blogs, all that good stuff. You do not want to go anywhere. For Jordan Breen, I'm Ariel Helwani. We will see you on Saturday night.